You can now download a free PDF copy of issue number 8 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine or order a beautiful printed copy. Go to newthinkingaloud.org. New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Book 3 in the New Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP. Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we're going to explore what it's like to be a student of remote viewing. With me is Dr. Paul Smith, who is one of the founders of the International Remote Viewing Association. He served as president of that association twice. He is also the author of Reading the Enemy's Mind and also The Essential Guide to Remote Viewing. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you. It's always great to be here sitting in the chair opposite you.
It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm delighted that you're able to come here to Albuquerque. You have an interesting perspective. You're a teacher of remote viewing, and at one time you were a student of remote viewing. In fact, a student who knew virtually nothing about remote viewing at all. You came in like a blank slate, so to speak.
Yeah, that's right. I had never heard the words remote and viewing put together. And I couldn't point to any instance in my life up to that point where you could say I had had a psychic experience or even speculate that it was a psychic experience. So it was really a new domain for me.
And so let's start with that. So as a student being exposed to this for the first time, and because you were given military directives that you were going to be part of this program, what was it like for you? What was it like being you then?
Well, in some ways, it was like any other preschool kind of experience where you're coming into a grade or a school for the first time. So there's a lot of anticipation, a little bit of anxiety, quite a bit of excitement. But then there's, of course, this added feature where, is this something that I can even do? Is it really real? You know, that's always the question. Is it really real? Yeah. And if it is, am I going to be able to do it, or am I going to embarrass myself totally? You know? So just the start. And of course, they gave us a little bit of an experience beforehand. We did an outbounder experiment where a couple of my colleagues, newly met colleagues, right, went off to a location which I had no idea of, and then they had me sit down and try and experience where they were and describe it. And that had been a failure yet a success.
A failure and a success.
Yes.
That's your very first experience.
Very first experience.
So, in other words, before you got any training, so to speak, they said, here, give it a shot.
Yeah. And I think you've had that kind of experience as well.
That's what it was like for me. And it kind of began there and mostly stopped at that point. Once I convinced myself that this is real, I didn't really pursue any further instruction.
Yeah. So the failure part of it is I failed to describe the actual location where they meant me to perceive them. The success part was I described a place they went afterwards. So the target was this big, huge, blue-colored, spider-like water tower. I mean, you couldn't miss it. It's just immense. Anytime you drove by any of the roads in the area, it was there on the horizon, right? That's where they went. Well, what I described was the donut shop they went to afterwards. And my father-in-law said, trust you to find the donuts and miss the water tower.
Well, the water tower may have been too obvious. Your conscious mind might have received the image and said, no, everybody sees that all the time. It couldn't be that.
It's hard to say why that happened. I have several different plausible explanations, but as Skip Atwater, my training officer at the time, said, he said, if you don't get the target, it doesn't matter what else you get instead. And that's pretty much what it boils down to with remote viewing.
Yet displacement is a big issue even today for students, as far as I know. It
can happen, yeah. It happens more often in the precognitive modality known as associative remote viewing. And there are a lot of reasons for that it'd be like watching paint dry to talk about all of them. But in actual remote viewing, at least operational style remote viewing we did, like the kind of thing you'd use to in an application way, to support the government. Displacement is a little less common in that.
Well, because you don't have two different targets.
That's
right. A correct target, an A target and a B target, an up target and a down target. You have just the target.
Yeah. And so in that respect, you can't remote view the wrong target. You can just remote view some other target that isn't the target. Or the target. That's your choice. And it's very obvious when you've remote viewed the actual target because the information you provide is consistent with what they know about that target.
Well, these days when students come to you, it's a very different situation. The Fort Meade remote viewing program doesn't exist as far as we know. People who come to you are not coming because they've been assigned by a commanding officer to be part of your training course. They come because they're motivated.
They are. And to be fair, actually, we were under similar circumstances. We had to volunteer for the program. And we could have any time said, I don't want to do this anymore. And there were people who did, right? So in a way, we kind of share that with our students. But they tend to have heard rumors of it and then read things about or heard about it on TV or seen videos, including many of yours, right, that they may have watched those. And in fact, you'd probably be surprised how many of my students tell me that they have watched your videos, the ones you produced for New Thinking Aloud.
I'm glad.
Yeah, I think that's great. And not just the remote viewing material either. But they come with at least some notion of remote viewing. Now, oftentimes they'll bring stuff they have to unlearn because there's a lot of misinformation as well as actual information about remote viewing out there on the internet and in books and things. But when they come in, at least they have an idea of what it is. And I say, when they first asked if I wanted to volunteer, I didn't even have an idea of what it was. So they come at least a little bit better prepared.
They probably have not only an idea, but since they, I presume, don't expect to use it in the context of military intelligence work, they probably have an idea of how they will apply this ability.
Yeah, at least well, it depends. Sometimes they come in and they're hoping I'll help them figure it out. Right? Well. This might actually be a good time to talk about why they come. Okay, so a lot of folks come in and they have this kind of often vague, but sometimes more specific idea that they're going to use it to help find missing kids or help police solve cases or maybe in investments or whatever. Or they want to explore other modalities like medical remote viewing, that kind of thing. But I would say the vast majority of people who come to take my class don't come for any specific purpose in terms of practical utilization. They're there as a kind of a self-actualization tool. Right? They're there to prove to themselves that this is real first and that they can do it second. Sometimes it's the other way around, actually. But their goal is to find out, what happens essentially is that we can find out, as Bob Monroe used to say, that they are more than their physical bodies, right? And for that, and that works really well for that, at least if they're diligent and conscientious. I've had some folks who come and don't apply themselves, and they don't have much of an experience. But the ones who do, oftentimes they will, when they actually describe a target that they don't know anything about, they have no idea what it is, they're blind to the target, and they produce information that is very strongly indicative of actually describing the target and being there in whatever sense that the remote viewer is there, right? it's like an epiphany for them. They get all excited. They're very thrilled by it. In fact, they're oftentimes kind of astonished. It's like they didn't expect it to work, and yet it did, and they get all
it's a high.
It is. It's a high.
It's almost like getting high on some substance.
Except healthier.
Yeah. It's a strong emotional high.
Yeah.
And at the same time, if you try it and you miss the target, it's a bummer.
It is. It is. And of course, that's maybe the downside to this.
Yeah. And I think probably, I'm guessing now, because I don't work with students the way you do, but I'm guessing that it's pretty essential for people to be able to distance themselves from the emotional ups and downs.
Well, that's a complicated element here. In one respect, emotion can help motivate you and help you to actually succeed as a remote viewer. On the other hand, it can actually cause you to choke, as they say in sports, right? I mean, if you get too emotionally involved or with the kind of wrong kind of emotion, it can kind of lock down the system so you actually don't get the perceptions, or if you do, you don't recognize them or whatever. In fact, one of the issues that student remote viewers run into is the inability to let go and let it happen. I've for close to 30 years now talked about remote viewing essentially being a Zen discipline. So in Zen, you don't worry about the outcome. In Zen, it's all about the process and about harmony and essentially, and I don't know the words here to use, but essentially shutting down the intellectual processes that would interfere with developing the process, developing the discipline, developing the letting go of it. Right? In remote viewing, you have to be able to let go in order to get. It's a real interesting irony about this. If you're worried about the outcome, and what I mean by worried about the outcome, you're worried whether you're going to fail or not. You go into a remote viewing session, you're almost certainly going to fail. Yeah. Right? If you're worried about succeeding, which is the flip side of the worrying about failure, you are probably not going to succeed. You have to be able to go into it with this just kind of, well, speaking in our normal everyday terms, laid back. Laid back, a mild curiosity. Gee, I wonder how this is going to turn out this time. Right? If you can go in with that kind of an attitude, you actually have the highest chance of success with that kind of letting go, letting it happen sort of an attitude. Well,
and my understanding of Zen is that the Zen practitioner learns to appreciate that, they don't have to experience magic. They could be, as they say, chopping wood and carrying water and discover that enlightenment is already there. But the goal is enlightenment.
Yeah. Well, and in a way, so is remote viewing, right? The goal of remote viewing in an interesting way is enlightenment. I mean, actually in a couple of ways. The first way, if you're learning it, you're trying to achieve enlightenment in terms of reconciling a whole new aspect of yourself with the rest of your nature, right? So, and that's an enlightenment. But on the other hand, if you look at it, if the goal is to collect information, that's a form of enlightenment as well, isn't it? So you're trying to enlighten yourself and perhaps enlighten the people who you're doing the work for in a certain, perhaps a little less spiritual kind of a way, right?
Well, let me ask you this. In your experience now, you've taught many, many students. I don't know, dozens, hundreds, thousands.
Not thousands yet, but hundreds, yeah.
Hundreds of students. Yeah. Do you find that there's a certain type of student who will end up dropping out of the program?
I think there's probably a variety of types of students. Identifying them, there's probably a different way of calculating this. It's not even calculation, but the people who drop out of the program are people who come in and they're motivated solely by curiosity. They're there to find out, does this really work? Once they've satisfied their curiosity that it really works, then they kind of lose interest and go off onto other pursuits. Now, there are some who legitimately intend to be remote viewers, and they'll come in, and unfortunately, personal issues, like maybe they have to become the primary caregiver for their elderly parents or something like that, and so they just don't have the time or energy to spend on it once they've come through the course. And those folks, we understand that. There are some folks who come in who almost already made up their minds that they don't want to do it, but somehow or other, I don't know if they're falling prey to peer pressure. Maybe their group of folks think remote viewing is cool, so they have to try it out or whatever. Mm-hmm. I don't have very many of those, thank goodness. Just maybe less than a handful that have done that, but there are those as well. So
I'm under the impression that in your training program and some of the other teachers who train remote viewing, it really requires a lot of discipline to become a consistently good remote viewer.
Yeah, it's like any complex human skill. You have to learn the right principles, and then you have to actually apply them and practice them. And so in anything that you want to really master, like from martial arts to playing the violin to basket weaving, I don't know, whatever art, if you're a studio artist, it takes a huge amount of work to achieve mastery in that. Remote viewing is no different than that in that respect. Just what you actually have to do may differ. So,
I mean, there are some skills, though. You take a weekend seminar, you get a certificate, and practice that skill. Remote viewing is not quite like that.
No, and it's interesting how many people come in expecting that. They think, well, I take a weekend class, then I can call myself a remote viewer. Well, that's like coming in and taking a weekend course and calling yourself a kung fu master, right? It just doesn't work that way. Now, certainly you can satisfy your curiosity, and there's actually nothing wrong with it. I don't want people to think I'm putting that down. If you're curious about it and you want to take a class, do it, right? If you don't have the motivation to continue on, there's nothing wrong with that. There would be something else that's calling you in your life.
I mean, in my case, my friends Hal Putoff and Russell Targ back in 1976 invited me to go to SRI International, where they were researching remote viewing, and they would show me. And I participated and got what I would regard as a good hit very first time. And then I occasionally would run weekend workshops and show people what I learned, and a good percentage of the people in the group would get a good hit, and then they would know that they had something unusual, and that was the end of it. I never actually, in my thinking, I didn't conceive of a long-term program. It was the ambiance at that time was you don't need that kind of training. You can learn to do it right away.
Yeah, and from the perspective they were coming from, that was right. Their view of remote viewing was essentially you go in and you behave in this way, and you produce information that a judge will be able to distinguish between possible targets and pick the right one, and you're done. Which is fine for whatever particular modality you're in, or if you just want to satisfy your curiosity. The way we use remote viewing, of course, that would have been totally inadequate in the military, because you would not be collecting the kind of detail that they needed. And I have to tell you, the devil is in the details. Okay, the reason is because the more detailed you get, the more you run the risk of your analytic functions in your mind taking over and starting inventing things. And so that's one of the aspects of remote viewing training. If you want to do it for operational cases, is learning how to avoid that over the long term. And nobody ever learns it completely. Even some of the best remote viewers in the world, Joe McMoneagle, for example, there are times when he just gets it wrong.
Well, one of the things I discovered, because eventually I did try to develop a training program for my doctoral research at Berkeley. I put together an 8-week training program for remote viewing. And I had a group of people who met with me 5 days a week, 8 hours a day for 8 weeks. And of course, we covered lots of other things beside remote viewing. But one of the things I discovered was everybody did quite well the first week. Then their scores dropped quite a bit. And the reason, I think, is because all of a sudden they're confronted with this reality, and all kinds of emotions come up around it, like, even at a subconscious level, things that are hard to articulate, but there are fears that come up for people around it. Do you experience that with your students?
So what you described is the thing that the folks at SRI dubbed the first time effect, or the
Beginner's luck.
Beginner's luck, yeah. So they would often have people come in wanting to see remote viewing demonstrated, scientists and reporters and such as that. And they would come in and so the SRA people would trot out whatever excellent remote viewer they had on staff that day, right? And then they'd run a remote viewing.
Or typically they'd have the person themselves.
Well, no, that came
viewer.
next. Yeah. So they bring in their standard remote viewer, and their remote viewer do a great job. And the people who'd come in and say, well, that was very impressive, but how do I know you weren't fooling me? Mm-hmm. And what Puthoff and Targ and Swan and those folks had realized is that somebody coming in and doing it for the first time had a much higher than normal chance of being successful at their first try and maybe their second try. That's what they call this first-time effect. So they realized if we people come in asking, I want to see it done, if we make them do it, then they'll know exactly what they knew, which was nothing. They'll know exactly what they received in terms of perceptions and what they reported. They will know all of that stuff, and so they will know whether it was faked or not, right?
Unless they think, I was secretly hypnotized.
As did happen, actually. But that didn't happen, but that belief did occur occasionally. Mm-hmm. So they used that from then on. They made the inquirer actually be the remote viewer. Yeah. And of course, you could imagine the reactions you got from these folks when they said, yeah, you're going to be a remote viewer. What? I can't do this.
And people surprise themselves that they can do it.
Absolutely.
But I think that there's an issue of integrating that knowledge into the whole personality.
Well, yes. And in fact, this responds to the other part of your question, actually. After the first time effect, then of course sobriety hits, right? The story that the SRI folks told was that what happens is when you do remote viewing the first couple of times, you're doing something that your underlying cognitive system doesn't really anticipate happening. So it's not prepared to deal with it. To speak in very general terms here, kind of rough and ready sort of description, you've got the left brain and the right brain. The left brain, its job is to interpret the information that the right brain introduces. And so the left brain has this obligation. I'm supposed to, to interpret what happened, and I failed this first time around. That caught me by surprise, so I didn't do it, right? So the next time you remote view, the left brain's ready and waiting, and the information comes in, and it starts interpreting the heck out of it, and gets it wrong because it's working on a narrow bandwidth that doesn't have sufficient information to draw accurate conclusions about the information. Mm-hmm. And so then you have this drop-off. Now, some of the other things you suggested probably play a role as well. For example, they may get a kind of, a couple of things could happen. First of all, they may be so emotionally caught up in it, so excited about their first time, that they anticipate having that same experience the next time, which in itself can stop or slow down the process. They may say, well, this is really real. What else in the universe isn't real the way I thought it was? And they may start developing a little bit of anxiety about what they're doing. Well, any of those factors can play a role. The biggest one is this cognitive tendency to want to interpret a signal that it's a little premature to interpret it.
Now, when I did my own doctoral research, I hypothesized that there would be what is known in statistics as a J-curve. They'd start out well, and their scores would drop, but then they'd come back up. And actually, that is what we found.
Right. In fact, if you see the curve that is in a lot of the SRI reports back to the CIA and the Department of Defense, they have this little graph that shows first time effect did really well. Then fairly quickly it falls off to about chance. And then as the slurring effect kicks in, they start learning how to manage that left brain interference. You see their performance increase again and come back up. And it was documented over and over again. So, yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that students have to struggle with is the fact that it's not always going to work for them. And in fact, there may be periods when it doesn't work for them at all. And they just have to be persistent and try different things. There's a lot of trial and error going on here in the learning experience with remote viewing. Attend to what it is that's happening inside of you. Pay attention to that and recognize how it feels. I have to, this is hand wavy because it's something that you can't actually show somebody. It's something they have to experience themselves.
They have to discover it inside of themselves.
Exactly. And the only way to do that is being put in a position where if you're going to succeed, it has to work. You have to do it. And then through trial and error, learn how it works for you. And it can be very frustrating at times. Some people have a harder time than others. Generally, the people who I found one indicator is that people who engage in a profession is very analytic. They have to, their left brain gets involved very often in their work. Those people tend to struggle to turn that off. Mm-hmm. It isn't so much turning it off as learning how to turn this one up, the opposite of it up, and learning how to differentiate between when it's noise that your cognitive processes you're throwing in versus the experiential nature of what you're getting. Now, you don't want to get rid of the cognitive process because particularly later on when you're going for the details, you want those two to harmonize. You want the experiential part and the cognitive part to work together. And that's, again, part of the trial and error. You really sometimes you'll have some struggles with that. As a student, that's maybe the most frustrating part is learn how to get them working together rather than have one dominate the other.
Mm-hmm. I know in the early days when I was interacting quite a bit with Puthoff and Targ about all this, they believed that the people who came to SRI were successful at remote viewing because by and large, these were people who were successful at most of the things they did. They were already successful professionals, whereas some of the early researchers at the universities who began working with students who are, struggling to identify themselves as who they are in the world and uncertain of themselves, in general, didn't score so well. The SRI team always seemed to produce the most successful results in those days.
Yes, that's interesting. There's a lot of ideas and data points and speculation about how you identify someone who's going to be successful in remote viewing. Yeah. I think more than, of course, there's this first principle that if you're successful in one thing, you're very likely to be able to be successful in many things. Mm-hmm. So I've always believed that you are a competent artist. You can probably be a competent musician and a competent writer as well. You just have to do the learning curves for each of those things. And that probably applies to remote viewing. Partly, I think, because, first of all, you've already learned how to learn. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people come to this and they haven't learned how to learn. And so they come in and they have preconceived notions and they don't know how to let go of one set of notions and be open-minded and allow this new program, if you will, to be installed, so to speak, right? And they just don't know how to do that. They may have really great underlying capacity to be a remote viewer, but it's the superficial stuff that stops them from doing it. They haven't learned to zen out, right? They haven't learned to allow the zen element of it to come in and just allow them to go with the flow.
Go with the flow.
Cliche,
yeah.
Right. And if they learn that, then I think that will overcome a lot of the problems that people have in trying to learn remote viewing successfully.
Mm-hmm. What about the social pressures that people are under? As I recall, when you were in the military program at Fort Meade, it was classified. You were not really allowed to discuss it with other people outside of the program, but your students are going to have friends and family and who are going to learn about what they're doing, and some of them will be disapproving.
They are. Oftentimes that happens, and that can go two different ways. One is that can dissuade the student from pursuing it, or sometimes it goes the other way. It actually encourages them. It's a challenge to them, and they're going to prove that it works. I mean, sorry to introduce my book here again, but that's one of the reasons I wrote Essential Guide to Remote Viewing. It wasn't to get rich. The idea of it was to fill this niche in the literature for it serves three sets of clients: people who just now heard of remote viewing, don't know much about it, and want to have a kind of a balanced view of what it's all about. People who have been involved in remote viewing for a while and have pushback from their friends or their family or whatever, and they want a source that isn't all sensational and weird and bizarre. They want something they can hand to them and know that they will be introduced to it in a rational way. And then there's the third set of people who've been in it a long time, but they have holes in their knowledge. They know a lot about some parts and not about others. And of those three sets, the ones who are getting pushback from their friends and family are the ones that I'm most interested in having that help. And I've had reports back that it has worked, that it's helped people introduce it to their relatives in a way that they said, oh, well, maybe this isn't quite as weird as I thought. That's kind of the reaction they get. And the pressure becomes less.
Well, do you have students who describe what they're doing and then the relative will say, okay, prove it to me?
Yeah. And they'll show them, well, look at this session they did and said, well, I don't believe that. You could have made that up. I want to see you do it right now, right? Yeah. But people who make that challenge, and we often get that from anybody who's skeptical, they want to see the actual.
They want to see it and they want to see it now.
That's right. Yeah. Prove it to me that it works.
Yeah.
What they don't understand is it doesn't really. You don't prove anything scientifically that way.
Yeah.
I mean, they would be perfectly happy reading the peer-reviewed literature on a scientific topic and they'd be totally convinced. Because this doesn't meet their worldview. We're talking about the skeptical folks again, right? Because this is outside their worldview. Somehow, peer-reviewed data doesn't seem to satisfy them. They've got to have some actual experiential element, which actually is not a scientific approach.
No, but that's human.
That's human psychology, not science. Yeah.
Right. And so what do your students typically do in those situations?
Well, sometimes they'll try and demonstrate it. And occasionally it's successful. I don't know how often it's successful. I can't tell you that, obviously. I don't even know how often they do it. But I have had some reports where it was successful. And in some cases it persuasive, in some cases it wasn't. Because again, the skeptic saw it happen, but they don't know if they're being fooled, and so just demonstrating it to them doesn't do any good.
Of course, one demonstration. The skeptic will say, if you can just prove it to me once, I'll be satisfied. Yeah. Don't believe them.
I don't know a case that ever happened.
Right.
Now, sometimes, the ones who are a little more mildly skeptical and entertained the possibility and knew that their relative or friend, the viewer was really, very. We got to have an adjective for integrity. Integrous. I don't know. Anyway, that had a lot of integrity. Occasionally, they've seen that done. Probably rarely actually jumped on the bandwagon, but at least were willing to start thinking that maybe, a little open-mindedly about it. And that's the most I hope for with a skeptic is they become open-minded about it and not a rejectionist about it anymore. If they become a convert, if we can talk in those terms, that's great. I mean, like Darrell Bem, he essentially became a convert. Of course, that was after a lot of work and a lot of demonstrations and stuff he participated in. But the average person, if they're just become open-minded about it, that's all I care about.
Now, there are issues that have been raised in some of the literature. I think a book by David Morehouse, for example, of that. The potential for people getting involved in remote viewing to experience psychotic episodes or mental imbalances, to go crazy or to be thought of as crazy. Has that come up with you and your students at all?
Well, I'm not having students go crazy that weren't already crazy. I say that funnily, humorously, but actually it's true. You get people who are having mental issues who are attracted to these kind of fields.
Sure.
Because in some way they think maybe there's a solution to what's
or a validation for them that they're not really experiencing a mental illness. They're just a budding psychic.
Yeah. Yeah, there's probably a number of explanations, but, and that's certainly a likely one, right? So they'll come in already with pre-existing conditions, and they may struggle with it a bit.
In fact, to my knowledge, roughly a third of the population is going to experience some sort of diagnosed mental illness in their lifetime. So, we probably all have a certain amount of predispositions.
Well, I'm hoping mine doesn't manifest during the course of this interview.
Don't worry, it already has.
You're right. I'm so sorry. Yeah. So, people who come in with a propensity or an actual manifestation of some kind of mental issue, remote viewing is not going to help them. And in fact, it could be a catalyst to push them over the edge in a certain way. And that has happened on a few rare occasions. But there's this kind of belief among certain sectors out there that remote viewing can make you crazy, to speak very, generically.
Yeah.
The fact is that it won't. It won't. Remote viewing is not dangerous. It will not make you crazy if you aren't already. It could exacerbate a situation, as many other kinds of behaviors can.
Sure.
Like you can come in and
serve as a trigger.
Yeah, or getting turned down by your girlfriend is probably a more likely catalyst than remote viewing is, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in and of itself, and a normal, healthy person isn't going to suffer any ill effects from it.
Mm-hmm.
And, we've seen the vast majority of people do this perfectly well with no issues.
What about the issue of letting it go to your head, thinking that after you've had a number of successes that I'm the great remote viewer and I can predict disasters, or I better warn people, or, people who set themselves up as some kind of a prophet. Have you encountered that with students?
Well, there's several folks out there. None of my students have gone off the rails like that, but there are some who have. And first thing I want to say is that you've already had a disaster if that's the way you go, the way your thoughts go. The beauty of remote viewing, at least if you're willing to acknowledge your outcomes, is that it's self-correcting. If you start getting too full of yourself and too impressed with yourself and too overwhelmed by your abilities, whatever, that actually you'll shut down in most cases, because then that's a form of emotional involvement as well, right? That's an odd kind of an emotion. And frankly, the more grandiose your expectations of success, the more likely you are to fall on your face. Now, the problem is with people who don't care so much about being honest about their results as they are about preserving face. And they'll often say and do and make claims and things about remote viewing and about their remote viewing, which if you actually analyze it from an objective way, you discover that they're not succeeding the way they say they're succeeding. And you see that, of course, in the paranormal field in general.
All across the culture, as a matter of fact. I think there's a tendency, especially in business, for people to exaggerate how successful they are.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, in a way, that's human nature again. I mean, you're keeping your ego intact by doing that, or puffing it up by doing it, right? It feels good to inflate your ego. It's when it explodes that the real issues happen, right? The pain sets in. But the interesting thing about remote viewing is that you have to be, again, we get into the Zen thing, right? In a way, you have to be fully honest about what you did in the process, fully honest about your success or failure in order to actually progress. So if, for example, and there are people out there who do this, I can't recall if we talked about this before, but they will try and make anything that they've remote viewed into a hit. Even if it doesn't even bear any relation to the target, they'll try and find some way of data fitting to make this bit of information they reported match the target in a way that shows that they were successful, right? And you cannot learn, you cannot progress if that's your attitude, because you will not acknowledge what you're doing wrong and try and correct it. You'll continue to do the same things wrong all the time. On the other hand, there's people who are kind of the other way. They're too self-critical. Those are the kind of people who can't pass a lie detector test even though they never did anything wrong, because they will second guess, well, I did tell a little lie a long time ago. I said that there was 15 hamburgers in the bag and there was only 14. Oh no, that was a lie, and the lie detector goes nuts, right? There are people who approach their remote viewing work that way. They'll look at it and say, well, I didn't get this, and this right. And so I'm not even going to think about this and this and this that I did get right. They don't think of those terms. So they reject any element of success they had, and they're not going to make progress that way either, because you have to be able to acknowledge what you're doing right in order to replicate that.
I would think one issue might be, with regard to the misses, that if I were trying to correct every remote viewing session and figure out what I did wrong each time it didn't work, I might run up against something akin to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, that some things are just unknowable.
Right. And of course, that's part of learning. In every one of my students' first homework that I send home with them at the end of our in-person class, I have a thing on how to evaluate your sessions. Self-evaluation is critical, but you have to be fully honest with yourself. And you also learn that there are some things you're not going to be able to make a call on. So don't worry about it.
Mm-hmm.
Later on, maybe you'll find out. Maybe not. You do have to also learn how to let go.
Yeah.
Again, that's a kind of a Zen element as well.
Because I would think, and I never served in the military, but my understanding is if you go out on a mission and the mission has mixed success, and then afterwards there's a review, you evaluate, what did I do right? What did I do wrong? How can I improve?
Right.
That standard military procedure, I assume. But and I imagine to the extent that you can apply that to remote viewing, you do. But to a large extent, there's so many uncertainties.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's maybe a further point. I don't know how many points we've ticked off here, but that's an additional point, right? Yeah. That you also have to learn to live with uncertainty. Learn that you're not always going to get closure. Folks, and that may be part of the problem with the people who are so much in their cognitive minds, because you skew in the direction of needing closure in that case. Yeah. There's some people who seem born that way. It's part of their personality to crave closure. And those guys are probably the ones that struggle the most with remote viewing, because there are times when you just aren't going to have an answer. You're just not going to know. And you have to be okay with that. And one way of helping is just to recognize, well, I may actually ultimately get an answer to that, and I'm willing to be patient for that answer to come.
Let the answer bubble up or something.
That's right. And if I don't get an answer, that's okay. There'll be other things I'll get answers to.
Well, let me ask you this question. You've had hundreds of students. What percentage of the people who come for remote viewing training are able to function at a professional level?
That's a tricky question. Let me answer another question you didn't ask first. And that is, how many people actually make it into fully advanced training, right? So let's just take the arbitrary number of 100. Of the 100 people who come and take my classes, I would say that I'll be generous and say maybe 15% of them, so 15 of those people actually go on to further training. The other 85 people, either they've satisfied their curiosity and they're done, or they've had personal issues come up that prevent them from continuing on, whatever it might be. 85 of those folks don't continue on. Of those 15 people that do continue on, most of them go all the way. Now, there'll be a few others that fall by the wayside because of personal issues or whatever. But by that point, they're beyond the curiosity stage. They're at the point wanting to make it operational in their lives in some way. So let's say 14 of those go on to the advanced course, and do advanced training and do their homework. Now, let's say 12 of the ones that finish the advanced course finish their homework too, right? Because when they take my classes, they have to go home, and I give them 10 follow-on sessions sequentially that they work to demonstrate that they've mastered the process, and that helps cement what they've learned in the in-person class, right? So let's say 12 of them. Of those, by that point, I would say probably 10 of those 12 are able to operate fairly consistently in an operational environment, given the opportunity. There's not a lot of opportunities yet, but there are increasingly more. So given the opportunity, they're able to function in that world.
We're talking roughly 10%. That's not bad. It's not the same. I mean, I took a real estate course and became a licensed real estate broker, and I think probably 90% of the people who go through that course can operate professionally, but remote viewing is different.
Well, it is, because it isn't something you measure. And in real estate, obviously, you can measure a person's success very easily in remote viewing. And also, there is a known process that is guaranteed, exaggerate, but 100% of the time to produce results. Obviously, it doesn't 100% of the time.
And there are probably hundreds of thousands of realtors who...
Yes. It's a very objective and observable process. Remote viewing, it's all happening in here, right? And the only observable part is what the remote viewer produces. And then, in terms of sketching or verbalization or things written down. And then that can be compared to what the unknowns are. And
I would imagine it's not so different from people who take art classes, that probably less than 10% of people who take a class in painting or drawing or sculpture are going to become professionals.
Yeah, that's probably true. And maybe for similar reasons, the ratios are similar. Obviously, there's going to be it's not exact. We're estimating here,
Yeah.
but yeah, it may be for similar reasons, because what the artist is trying to do does a lot of it happen up here, and it depends on what ends up on the paper or in the stone or whatever on our observation of how well they mastered it or not.
Now, of course, a lot of people, at least in the old days, a lot of people used to take courses and classes and college programs even with the thought that they are preparing themselves for a career, that somebody's going to give them a job.
Yeah.
Now, I think it's pretty clear there are very few jobs, if any, in remote viewing. If you do have a career, it will be because you can function as an entrepreneur or a consultant.
Yeah, that tends to be true. There are some folks now establishing what I would consider fairly well-grounded companies, if you will, that
Cottage industries.
Cottage industry, yeah, because usually they run it out of their house. But yeah, cottage industry where they solicit real-world tasks for hire or pro bono, depending on what the circumstances are. And then have remote viewers that they have recruited and vetted, and then they work that way.
And I expect we'll see more and more of that.
Well, hopefully. Of course, the trick here is it's like remote viewing itself and remote viewing teaching and all that, is that there's no licensing authority, if you will. And in some ways, that's good. I wouldn't want there to be licensing authority, but people need to recognize the difficulties that brings up, and that is that anybody can claim to be a remote viewing teacher, and no matter what they know, and no matter what their experience is or what they believe about remote viewing, and a lot of people do claim to teach remote viewing that don't even actually, if you tried to get them to define it, their definition would not match anything that SRI would recognize, for example, right? And there are people, the same thing in the operational world. It's easy to set up a business, a cottage industry, to do operational viewing, but there's no one to vet the quality of that effort unless there are other people out there are legitimately competent remote viewers and remote viewing managers who can say, yeah, what they're doing makes sense, what they're doing works. But there are a lot of folks out there who are doing this who don't have that, and they in fact don't have much of a background, and yet they're still doing it. So it's really a buyer beware kind of a thing, even if you're not buying anything, right? It's that principle. But
there are also people who are doing it who are meeting with some success, and I imagine that word of mouth will probably enable them to
helps
develop a real career.
Yeah. We're strayed a bit from students here, but the thing to say about that is some of these folks are just giving it a chance. They may have resources that they can spare, and they have a problem they want to solve, and it hasn't been solved in some other way. So they'll say, "You're not hurt anything to try remote viewing, and maybe it'll work."
Yeah.
And if those guys have success, then they may talk to somebody else who's in a similar situation and whatever. Obviously, in a field like this, you can't guarantee you're going to have success. Of course, in the legal field, you don't either, right?
Right.
You say, okay, well, the lawyer says you're going to pay me even if we lose the case, right?
And so does the doctor.
And so the medical profession, yeah. Although in the medical profession, there's at least some science, not totally. I like to joke that medicine is really more of an art than a science, but at least there's some objective facts that they're dealing with, and I suppose there are in law as well. In remote viewing, you have to produce the objective facts, right? And that can be assessed and evaluated. And you can't guarantee that'll happen because we don't know how it works yet. We know some of the parameters that help you have a higher likelihood of success, but we don't know any parameters will guarantee success. And that's the situation where we're at in remote viewing.
Well, there seems to be a lot of individual differences. Some researchers, like Stefan Schwartz, who I've interviewed many times, is engaged in archaeological projects with law enforcement, and he reports. Of course, he works with some of the most well-established remote viewers with a very rigorous methodology, but he has quite a track record.
Well, yeah, he's published some really, really juicy results, some really nice stuff. And
Put Off and Target, SRI, had a very, like an 85% success rate with their published studies.
Yeah, they had some good success as well.
Mm-hmm.
But again, of course, in the Put Off Target situation, that was, of course, a limited trial set, right?
Yeah.
There's certain experimental. You have to do that in a science setting. You have to have control of your variables.
Right.
So what they did there is, of course, significantly different than what Stephen Schwartz did.
Absolutely.
In his. Same function, but the way it was used and the extent to which it was used is different. And of course, other people have had success along the lines of Stephen Schwartz, although maybe not in archaeology, but in other things. Mm-hmm. And of course, there have been plenty of failures as well, which you don't hear as much of, right?
Well, there are failures in every endeavor.
Sure.
I mean, for example, drilling for oil or investing in the stock market. Anybody who's a speculator or an investor knows you're going to have failures. And they try not to take it personally. I mean, you just move on to the next one. And,
right, which we're getting back now to the student thing, because students have to have that attitude if they're going to succeed. Yeah.
The truth is, I think for every successful entrepreneur, they've had many failures.
Yeah.
Walt Disney, I believe, went bankrupt 7 times, for example. As did Abraham Lincoln went bankrupt.
Well, I don't know that much about his history, but I'm sure.
I hope that's correct.
Well, it doesn't matter. Yeah. I mean, the principle is the same.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and if you develop that attitude, you will have much higher chance of success than if you have to be right every time. Somebody who comes into this field thinking they're going to be right every time or having that need to be right all the time, they are not going to make it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Paul Smith, this has been a informative conversation, and you're coming from decades of experience. So, and you're still out there.
Still out there for now. I'm getting older, though.
It's a pleasure to be with you once again, Paul. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're quite welcome.
And thank you for being with us.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download a free PDF copy of issue number 8 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine or order a beautiful printed copy. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.